For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the gist tonight, we're looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the UN, and a new Cold War. Our expert tonight is Ambassador Asoke Mukerji. He's been India's former permanent representative at the United Nations. Ambassador, good evening.
Good evening. Nice to be with you, Amitabh.
Ambassador, just looking at what's happening at the UN, of course, the UNGA will be a second day of talks by various officials. But how things have panned out there, could you explain to our viewers, India's strategic partners, the US and the West, and what we've been doing in terms of taking positions or abstaining or making statements of why we are doing what we're doing with the resolutions that have come up so far?
Well, Amitabh, I think, we have a position calling for dialogue, for diplomacy, which is actually based on the UN Charter, because Chapter 6 of the UN Charter is devoted entirely to how diplomacy should be used to diffuse crisis, conflict situations, and they go step by step. So it's unfortunate that these provisions of the UN Charter have been ignored in recent years by the Security Council, which has been more keen to apply a robust interventionist approach through Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And I think that that's an important point to understand, because when the Charter was drafted and created, Chapter 6 was the heart of the UN Charter, that succeeding generations, we would prevent the scourge of war through diplomacy and through negotiation. So it's called the Pacific Settlement of Disputes. Now, as I said, this has been not sort of prioritized by the Security Council. And therefore, when we participate now as an elected member in the Security Council, we have to try and bring the focus onto negotiation and a diplomatic dialogue, rather than go down the path of enforcement. And I think that with the first resolution that was drafted by the United States and Albania, who call themselves the pen holders of the Security Council, which means that they have the first shot at a draft of a resolution, which is a completely opaque system, which is they're not elected as pen holders, they declare themselves to be pen holders. So these two countries put together a draft, and they invoked Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which meant that if, for example, the Russian Federation did not heed this resolution, if it had been adopted, then the Council under the Charter would have the right, legal right, to invoke Article 41, which is on economic sanctions, or Article 42, which is the use of military force to enforce the resolution. So this approach was doomed to fail, because it was aimed at a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, which has a veto. So when drafting this resolution, the countries that drafted, which includes a permanent member, the United States, knew very well that this resolution would not see the light of day. So I think India's position in response to that first draft was based on our experience. This is our 8th time that we are sitting in this UN Security Council since 1950. We know that when a permanent member is involved, the chances of such resolutions being adopted are minimal, remote. And therefore, we called for going back to Chapter 6 and trying the path of diplomacy rather than the path of enforcement. So that was one part. The second issue is, the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, this is something that in India, people who deal with the United Nations Security Council are very, very aware of this issue, because in fact, India was one of the first members of the United Nations to go to the Security Council to ask the Security Council to vacate the violation of India's territorial integrity by Pakistan in 1948. On 1st of January 1948, a letter to the Security Council was written asking them to take cognizance of the violation of our territorial integrity in Jammu and Kashmir and to get the aggression vacated. Now, for reasons linked with Cold War politics and the politics of the United Kingdom in South Asia, which had created the partition of India, this complaint of ours on territorial integrity and sovereignty was converted by the permanent members of the Security Council into the India-Pakistan question. Now, there was no question of applying the India-Pakistan question to an issue of the territory of one of the princely states of India, which was not bound by the laws of the partition of India into two communal states. So I think that this was in our mind, and when we saw that the Security Council did not succeed in getting the territorial occupation by Pakistan vacated, and in 1954, when the United States envoy Dr. Graham reported to the Security Council that Pakistan is not going to withdraw its troops from the territory it had occupied in Jammu and Kashmir. That was, for us, the clearest signal that this Security Council, dominated by the Cold War politics between the permanent members, would not be in a position to uphold this principle of the UN Charter. And I think that that is something that we have seen.
As you're saying, Ambassador, I mean, you, including when you were serving in New York, are acutely aware of the implications of not only every letter and word, but a comma or a semicolon on this issue. When you look at India's statements that have come out on the issue, one of the first ones had no mention of both India and the UN Charter's core principle of, you're talking about territorial integrity and sovereignty, and instead not instead, but did talk about how security concerns of all parties should be involved. How do you see the Indian statements in this context? Now they are, of
Well, I,
course, a key part of
Yes,
all this debate.
and I think that again, if you look at the way we have applied our experience in the Security Council, I think it is possible to see the context in which we have focused on the legitimate security interests of all parties, because the conflict on the ground and the armed action, the use of military force on the ground has been taken in response to a security issue which has been raised by Russia in this case. Now, if we had gone down the path of diplomacy, we would have been able to discuss this issue through a diplomatic framework, even in the Security Council or as a group of the Security Council dealing with the Ukraine issue. But from the time the Security Council adopted its resolution on Ukraine in 2015, endorsing the Minsk agreement on Ukraine, it has done nothing to monitor the implementation or even to enforce the implementation of its own resolution on upholding the Minsk agreement. So therefore, to anyone who is not involved as a party to the Minsk agreement, but is a member of the United Nations, it is very important to know what is the reason why the Minsk agreement was not implemented. And I think that was behind that is the context in which the first statements by India focusing on the diplomacy should be seen. Because, as you said, now we have in our subsequent statements focused on the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty of states and the UN Charter. But we have gone through a similar experience in December 1971 in the Security Council. And I think that is something that's very relevant, because in December 1971 and before December 1971, we had been talking about our security issues in East Pakistan, which the international community just did not take on board, except the Soviet Union and France, and to a limited extent the UK. But it was basically the Soviet Union which used that episode in December 1971 to enable us to meet our own security interests, which were focused in terms of the humanitarian problem caused by 10 million refugees having come into India because Pakistan did not want to uphold democracy, the results of the democratic elections of 1970, which gave a majority to the Awami League of East Pakistan in Pakistan's parliament. So that is the experience we have gone through. And we know
Sure.
that that isolates people if you don't have an engaged international community. And therefore, I think today also we see a similar polarization because it is almost like a new Cold War. That is, it's an ideological. But what is the ideology is not very clear. It could be the ideology of democracy and authoritarianism, but that discussion in the UN has not really been resolved because states which are called by Western countries as authoritarian states turn around and say that they have conducted elections and they are elected
Yep.
as presidents of their own countries. And so, how do you draw the line? That is an issue which also needs to be discussed.
I'm just going to ask for your quick responses to some viewer comments, questions, Ambassador. Omkar Dadpe says about the inefficiency of the UN in decision making. Is this a recent phenomenon, or has the UN always been a loudspeaker for powers to state their position on topics of global concern?
Well, in my experience, this has been a long-standing problem with the United Nations Security Council in decision making on issues of political interest to the five permanent members. So they have not hesitated to use their veto, which is given to them by the UN Charter, to block any decision that they do not like. And you have a list of vetoes which runs into several pages cast by each of the five permanent members on issues of political interest to them. Where UN decision making in the Security Council has actually been more positive and has endorsed action is in response to, for example, global challenges. The resolution of September 2001 responding to the attacks on 9/11 in the United States was unanimous, and that created the whole architecture of the Security Council on countering terrorism. Similarly, there was a unanimous Security Council resolution supporting a coordinated international effort against the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And that was again something that was very clear. When the Sustainable Development Goals were being negotiated, the Security Council did not make it political. It endorsed the way the UN General Assembly adopted the goals of Agenda 2030. So on those issues, there is much more positivity, if I may use that word, in terms of Security Council decisions. But on issues which are purely political or security-related issues, the permanent members dominate. And because they have the veto and because they prevent the reform of the Security Council, which was called for in 2005 by all world leaders meeting at the 60th anniversary summit of the United Nations. So because the permanent members refuse to reform the United Nations Security Council, we are in this state where we are today.
A quick answer, Ambassador, to Makarand Joshi, who says, isn't it true that if it weren't for the veto power available to Russia and China in the Security Council, the UN would be an entirely West-driven front?
Yes, because out of the five permanent members, three are from the Western European group, and that is France, the United Kingdom, and United States of America. Now, that's a group of countries which have given three members. They belong to the Western European and other states group. Now, altogether, there are 29 countries of that group. Now, can you imagine that 29 countries of that group are part of a 193-member General Assembly of the United Nations? And yet, this group refuses to part with their concentration of power in the Security Council through the permanent membership. They have not supported steps to bring countries which are from developing country groupings, especially the Africa group, 54 members from Africa, not a single permanent member. From the Asia Pacific group, there are 54 members from the Asia Pacific, and only China is a member. But that was Chinese membership was decided before the UN was created at the Cairo Conference of 1943. So this is something that has to be done, and I think that this crisis that has overtaken Ukraine, because it is now on the television screens of the West, it shows, and I think if we listen to the remarks by, for example, the ambassador of Ireland in the Security Council against the veto, then I think they should now walk the talk and either democratize decision making in the Security Council by removing the veto, or make the veto so conditional that it would be the rarest of rare sort of uses. It would have to follow very strict conditionalities. But that requires negotiation, and none of
Yeah.
these people are willing to negotiate.
Another one from Jaideep Gadavi, who says, what about Ukraine's assertion, Ambassador, that members party to the resolution shouldn't vote or veto on it? How valid is that as an objection?
Well, it is a provision in the charter, and a country like Liechtenstein, I think, has been drawing attention to this. Not only this time, but also, for example, when the United States vetoed resolutions targeting Israel's actions against the Palestinians. So it has applied to the United States. It has applied to the Soviet Union and now Russia. So this is something that is what we call the double standards at work, because none of the permanent members actually want to enforce that provision of the charter, which requires a permanent member not to sit in judgment on its own case. I mean, that is the point being made. But since this is again part of the procedures and what they call traditions of the Security Council, it doesn't even have working procedures that have been agreed upon. Everything is provisional. From 1946 onwards, they call it the provisional working procedures of the Security Council. So the permanent members are really to blame, if I may use that word, for this situation in which even the charter's provisions are not being implemented. As, for example, I mean, just to digress, but to give an example, the charter also in Article 44 of the charter clearly says that if a country is giving troops for a peacekeeping operation which is mandated by the United Nations Security Council, then that country, if it is not a member of the Security Council, has the right to sit in the decisions of the Security Council on the deployment of those troops. But these permanent members refuse, and they have refused from the beginning. So this is how they behave, and there is no accountability because none of them were elected. And I think that's the heart of the issue. None of these five were elected as permanent members.
Two related questions on India's position at the UN. Harshal says, for how long can India keep abstaining in the UN? Is it possible that we'll be left alone and compared to China, which is supporting Russian aggression? And Vinita Ahire, who says, will this balanced approach and not calling Russia out go well with the West, especially the US?
Well, I think two things have to be kept in mind when we look at it, and I think that abstention is also a position. It is the middle path position, and we are not in justifying either the action on the ground, nor are we justifying the proposed response. So those are the two extremes, and we are in the middle. Now, but I think that we also need to recognize we have our own position as India, and we have been among the leading voices for dialogue and democracy in decision making. So, in the context of our discussion just now on the veto, we have a different position. We are not a military ally of either of the sides of this issue. So we are partners of both. We are strategic partners of both Russia and the United States. So we have the right to take our own view. But more than that, most people forget that the elected members in the Security Council are elected on behalf of the regional groups. And we represent, we were elected by our constituency, which is the Asia Pacific Group. And the Asia Pacific Group has 54 members in the UN General Assembly. And out of these 54, only 5 co-sponsored the resolution. And these 5 were Cyprus, Fiji, Japan, Kiribati, and Kuwait. None of the other members of the Asian Pacific Group in the United Nations co-sponsored the resolution that was vetoed. So therefore, we have to be also in touch with our own constituency. And for our constituency, the pressing issues on the agenda include Afghanistan, where the Security Council has just washed its hands of a complete takeover of a country by a proscribed terrorist organization. So, we can't go along with these double standards. So therefore, are we alone? We are alone in the sense that we are not part of the Western military alliance. But are we alone in the United Nations? I don't think we are alone. We are with the other 134 developing countries, the vast majority of whom did not co-sponsor this resolution.
Controversial question, I would say, in a way, from Vinayak Ram says, should all nuclear powered nations be given a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council?
It's not a controversial question. I think this is something that has to be negotiated. So when the nuclear weapons criteria was used to create the discrimination of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it was sort of pushed into the system that these 5 countries which had nuclear weapons by the cutoff date would become the nuclear weapons states and would therefore have no further obligations to go down the road of nuclear disarmament. And the rest of the world was supposed to go down the road of nuclear disarmament. Now, India broke that myth by our own test of May 1998, and now we are a declared nuclear weapons state. Now, whether only nuclear weapons are the only criteria for permanent membership or not has to be discussed and debated in the General Assembly and included in the Charter. But again, we go back to the same point which I have been making, that there is no serious intent in negotiating or reviewing the provisions of the UN Charter as far as the Security Council and its permanent membership is concerned. And that is the big problem that we face.
Omkar Dadpe is saying now that there is an Indian casualty, 21-year-old Naveen in Kharkiv. Will India's position, not necessarily in the UN, change?
Well, India's position has been from the very beginning of this discussion in the Security Council, and now that the General Assembly is also discussing it, has been that we are concerned about the security and safety of our nationals. And we have given the figure in the debate, in the discussion of 20,000 Indian nationals, Indian passport holders are in the Ukraine. So as any member state government, we are concerned about our own citizens. And I think that therefore the need for a diplomatic approach is even more important. Because if we are now to use this unfortunate tragic event of the death of one of our nationals to cast our lot with a military alliance which is now raring to take robust action against against Russia, then where do these 20,000 Indian citizens get caught? They are caught in the middle of a huge conflict. So it is not in our interest to get into a situation where we cannot even look after our own citizens who are in Ukraine.
Another question here. This was interesting, actually. Puneet Pansari asked the Ukrainian permanent representative question the legitimacy of Russia being a member of the UNSC. What was that about?
Well, that was again about how did Russia become a permanent member, replacing the Soviet Union? And the answer is quite clear legally that as the successor state, Russian Federation assumed all the obligations and rights of the Soviet Union. So because of that, the Soviet debt, the international debt of the Soviet Union was repaid by Russian Federation. So when Russia has paid the price for taking the role of the Soviet Union, then Russia becomes the successor of the Soviet Union in the Security Council. And this is an interesting issue also because I think not many people are aware that when the United Nations was created, of course, the Soviet Union, which was headed by Stalin at that time, negotiated the veto and ensured that it would be able to protect its interests in the Security Council by using the veto. So that was something that was negotiated. But when it came to the membership of the United Nations General Assembly, the Soviet Union was very, very conservative, in fact, opposed to a large number of countries becoming members of the General Assembly as they got independence, because their feeling was that these countries, which were earlier colonies of either France or the United Kingdom, would enter the General Assembly and take positions in support of France and the United Kingdom against the Soviet Union. So two countries, or two countries today, but two components of the Soviet Union, which also became members of the 51-member General Assembly in 1946, were Ukraine and Belarus. These were the two. Now, the question can be asked also that why did the other 13 not become members of the United Nations in 1946? Only Ukraine and Belarus. And the answer to that is that it was three states, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, who in 1922 got together and created the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, it was these three states, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, who decided to break up the Soviet Union. So these three states have a place. And for us in India, I mean, I sometimes mention this in some of my talks, but after independence in August 1947, one of the first things that India wanted to do was to get elected to the Security Council. And the seat that was falling vacant was being vacated by Australia. So we put our candidacy in, but it was only in August, after August 1947. And in keeping with what I just mentioned about the Soviet Union's approach to new states, the Soviet Union put up Ukraine as the candidate to oppose India. And in that election of 1947, for 6 weeks, the General Assembly could not get a two-third majority vote in favor of either Ukraine or in favor of India. And it was on 13th of November 1947 that India conceded the seat to Ukraine. And Ukraine became an elected member of the Security Council from 1st of January 1948. And of course, with historical hindsight, we now know that we took our complaint to the United Nations Security Council on the 1st of January 1948, and we were not in the council because we had given our seat to Ukraine. And I gave you what happened to our complaint on the territorial violation of our territory, which the Security Council completely, turned around and made it into something else. So Ukraine was a part of the Security Council when this happened. So these are all historical facts, but how much they apply today is of course very different.
When you're talking about historical facts, Ambassador Harshal has another one. How valid is the reason that since Ukraine voted and condemned India on Article 370, and we can go into other historical votes as well, nuclear tests, so India has decided not to vote in favor of Ukraine or censure Russia?
Harshal, these calculations and these considerations are never part of any public position of any country. No country will publicly say that these are the reasons why we took this position. At least no major country will say it.
Again, when you were talking about the UNGA and the expansion and how after the Soviet Union, Russia didn't want newly independent countries coming into it, can you explain what's happening in the UNGA and the resolution there, under what chapter it is and what authority does it really have? I mean, it's not legally binding, of course.
Yeah, well, it is under a provision. In 1950, the General Assembly had adopted a resolution which is called Uniting for Peace, which is to bring everybody together. Again, this whole focus is on diplomacy. I mean, you don't bring everybody together to declare, to then conduct a global war. You bring everyone together, uniting for peace. It's called Uniting for Peace. So the objective should be peace. And in the current context, Ukraine had called for a session of the General Assembly. And that session is an emergency session because there's no agenda item on Ukraine in the current General Assembly agenda. So it's a special session. It's called an emergency session. And as you rightly pointed out, the session has a discussion. It is for members in the General Assembly to propose a resolution if they want, and to get a sense of the House or the views of the House resolution to be tabled in the General Assembly. There are no vetoes. It's a simple majority that carries the resolution. So you need 97 countries to support the resolution out of 193. And then that resolution, as you rightly said, is not legally binding. It is a moral position, but not a legal position. And therefore, I think as a member of the General Assembly and one of the countries which has been very active in the General Assembly, for India, it's very important that the discussion and the outcome of the General Assembly actually opens the path for a diplomatic solution to this conflict, keeping paramount the importance of peace, because that is the title of the resolution, is uniting for peace. So how do we bring peace? And for that, I think we have to go into chapter 6 of the charter, as I said right at the beginning, and focus on how to bring peace to the issues which have provoked this conflict. And those issues are known to people who are from that region of the world. And I mentioned them in the Minsk agreement. Those issues are very clearly, it's not that we have to rediscover what are the reasons for this conflict. The reasons for this conflict go and are there in that document, the Minsk agreement, which was negotiated under the sponsorship of France and Germany. Later, it was Russia became a part of that structure, and there is a process of informal interaction between France, Germany, and Russia and Ukraine, which is called the Normandy process. It's a process of using telephone conversations to be in touch among the leaders and the foreign ministers and so on. And that is what actually was supposed to deal with these sets of issues, which should not have resulted in this crisis. But the question today is, why was this Minsk agreement not implemented? And that the rest of the world does not know, because we are not part of the Minsk agreement. Even the United States is not party to the Minsk agreement. So, I mean, that's how it is.
You mentioned 1948, 1971, and history and what had happened with India. In light of that, this question from lifelong learning, do you think, I mean, and we've also seen, pictures of almost a dozen 20-kilometer long column of Russian equipment and tanks and troops, which are, heading towards Kiev. In light of those two things, do you think Russia will seek to be decisive very soon? His question is, of course,
Well,
of upcoming 48 hours.
I can only go by the experience. I mean, each case is different. But in 1971 December, what was our position? We were in a similar position. We were conducting a military campaign on the ground. The objective was to restore democracy to that country which we recognize on the 6th of December as Bangladesh. And as soon as that campaign was over on 16th of December, so there was a signing of a ceasefire in Dhaka. The surrender document was signed, and in 3 months' time, the entire Indian army came out of Bangladesh. So that was how it was done by us. Now, I do not know what will happen in this case.
Harshal, as a one, so what is the mural or painting in the background in the UNSC meeting hall?
Well, in the hall itself, there is a painting behind the president of the Security Council, which shows, it's a gift from Norway, I think, and it shows the different communities of people, mankind, representing all parts of the global population, busy with their work, and the importance of peace for progress. That is the message of that mural at the back. When you enter the Security Council, where the media is congregated to get a briefing on what happened, there is another painting which was just been put back there. That is by Picasso, and it's called Guernica. And the Guernica painting actually shows the horrors of conflict. So the ambience in which the Security Council actually meets is meant to encourage peace and dialogue and progress and constructive sort of engagement. But very too often, for reasons linked with other parts of our human character and activity, what Shakespeare perhaps called the dogs of war, they prevail over all the people who try and get peace.
An existential India at the UN question, Ambassador. I think this should be our last one. Makaran Joshi says, unless we join one of the two blocks or get a permanent seat, the UN isn't useful for us. Why do we keep funding it and manning the peacekeeping missions?
I think the UN is very important for us, Makaran, and you just have to look around you and look at the way, for example, the United Nations is meant to create a supportive international environment for countries like India, which have very big challenges to overcome. The biggest challenge is poverty. And after this pandemic, the number of people who require more assistance to get back to their jobs, to get back to their vocations is higher. The World Bank has estimated 100 million people across the world have been pushed back into poverty by the pandemic. So you need an international environment to support the normalization and the growth of India, of the Indian economy, of Indian society, of all the young people in India who are looking for a bright future in which they'll be employed and will contribute to making India great. Now, if you don't have such an international environment, and we are now getting into a fractured situation of one military bloc against another military bloc, etc., that is not going to help us, because we will be buffeted between the dynamics of the politics and the military dynamics of these two blocks of alliances. And we have never been part of any alliance. And that's the reason why we've never been part of any alliance, is because we have our own priorities, and we represent 1/5 of the human population today. So if 1/5 of the human population wants to get on with its life and needs a supportive environment, then you do need this only universal institution that we created in 1945, the United Nations. And most people have forgotten that the creation of the United Nations is due to the military victory of the Allied forces in the Second World War. And India and Indians, 2.5 million Indian soldiers contributed to that victory. So it is as much our United Nations as it is the United Nations of the West or of the East. So I think that we need to take ownership of the United Nations and make sure it works for our transformation.
Ambassador Ashok Mukerji, as usual, thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise with all of us.
Thank you. I hope that we are able to achieve our objective of peace and development, because those are the priorities for us as we come out of the pandemic, which has been equivalent to a third world war, if I may call it that, in terms of its global impact. You just have to see every country has been impacted by this pandemic. So it is about time that we put aside these issues which divide us and focus on issues which unite us.
Harshal, thanks you. Excellent discussion and analysis. Thanks for all your answers and explaining it so nicely. Thanks again, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amitabh, for having me on your program.
The pleasure is all ours on StratNews Global. And if you like this video, do share the link with your professional colleagues. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. We are at 100,000 subscriber mark, and follow us on our social media handles. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.